Good morning and welcome to the YouTube channel of St George's, East Ivanhoe. My name is Richard Wilson. I recently joined the parish as an honorary associate priest. Father John, the vicar, has asked me to make a video to give you a few details about who I am and where I came from. So I'm going to start right at the beginning. I was born in Mildura sometime in the 50s. Let's not go through the detail. I was born into a family that was nominally Anglican. My grandmother on my mother's side was a pillar of the Anglican church in Redcliffs, where she lived, just outside Mildura, St Mark's. But it was my father's mother who actually started my life in the church. She was a Presbyterian, and I have vivid memories as a very young boy going to Sunday school at the Presbyterian church in Mildura. We lived on a farm just on the outskirts of Mildura. My father and his father grew grapes for the dried fruit industry. But we moved from there in about the mid-60s when my grandfather sold the farm. My father moved to do a short-term role with the regular army in Melbourne. This was during the Vietnam War, of course. And we moved around a bit. And I sort of started going to church in Melbourne a little bit. I remember taking myself off as about a 10-year-old boy to the local Presbyterian Sunday school by myself, unaided or not really supported by my family, I'd have to say. So Sunday school had sort of become something of a theme for me, something that I really enjoyed. We moved from Melbourne in the late 60s. We went to South Australia, back to the Riverland as it turned out. My father set up a vineyard on the north bank of the Murray River, and I went to high school in Waikerie, which was the nearest largest town. At school in Waikerie, I studied science subjects mainly, and our life was a pretty quiet one actually, because we lived well out of town and there was no church engagement by our family at all at that time. My parents were not churchgoers at all. When I'd finished high school, I moved to Adelaide. I went to the University of Adelaide and studied science. I lived at St Mark's College, which is the Anglican, then all-male college in Adelaide, the equivalent, I suppose, of Trinity here in Melbourne. And I studied again science. I studied human science subjects. I graduated with a degree which majored in biochemistry and pharmacology. But one of the most formative times for me was to be at a college which was supported by the church and which had an active church life, and to join in a group of people my own age, university students, and to start going to one of the local youth congregations in the city itself. Along with, I might add, the now Bishop of Ballarat, Bishop Gary Weatherall. But that really formed me as a Christian person, I suppose, in a Catholic interpretation of Anglicanism. After university, I moved to Melbourne. In my last year at university, I'd been offered a job in a government cadetship through the agency of the master of the college. I took up this cadetship in Melbourne with the Department of Defence and started work here in Melbourne. By now it's the late 70s. And eventually I moved on, as you do in these cadetships, and joined the Department of Foreign Affairs and started a career which lasted for about 13 years as a Foreign Affairs officer. My first posting was shortly after I joined the department. I was sent to London to do some training with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. That was only a short posting. I came back and then did a series of roles in Melbourne, and at that time I joined St Peter's Eastern Hill, a congregation that I'd heard of when I was in Adelaide, and again fitted my formation in the Catholic tradition. And I was a parishioner there for a short while. I also attended Christchurch Hawthorn for a little while too, which was a quite different church from what it is now in those days. In 1983, I was on my first long-term overseas posting with the department, and I went to Kuala Lumpur, where I worked in the refugee program there alongside the immigration department, and I had a responsibility to visit the refugee camps in Southeast Asia, primarily the one in the South China Sea off the coast of Malaysia called Pulau Bedong. You may have heard of it back at that time. I also visited the Khmer refugee camps on the Thai-Cambodian border on a regular rotating basis, and also a small refugee camp in Singapore. So I got to know the area pretty well. Just before I moved to Kuala Lumpur, I met my now wife, Amanda, and she followed me eventually to Kuala Lumpur. We were married here in Melbourne, and then she came to live, and we started our life together in Kuala Lumpur. That posting ended and we came back to Australia, moved to Canberra. As a young couple, we bought a house and continued our work. Eventually, not too long after actually, I was posted back to Southeast Asia, to Singapore for another long-term posting, 2.5 years. And so we moved together, and as it turned out, our first child, our eldest daughter, was born in Singapore, in a hospital in Singapore. By this time in Kuala Lumpur and in Singapore, the opportunities for someone in my role as a government employee working in the high commissions in both countries, moving into a Christian community was probably not the easiest thing to do. There were cultural and language barriers. There was also the issue of, how do you represent your country in a role where, and in a place where the community is not largely Christian, and the Christian community that does exist is something of a minority. So these were fairly sparse years for me in the Anglican or in the church of any kind. But we came back to Canberra. Our second child was born there, but by that time I'd decided that I needed to get out of the public service and move into something that was a bit more different and offered a different set of opportunities, which Foreign Affairs wasn't really giving me at that time, I'm afraid. Eventually I joined Telstra. I'd started doing some extra study at this time. I started an MBA in order to be the generator of my exit out of the public service. Joined Telstra. I had a good time at Telstra. I worked there for 6 years on IT projects. I became a business IT mediator, I suppose you would call it, something that I learned obviously on the job. I'd had no training in that. And we moved to where I'm speaking from now, the house that I'm in as I speak now, in Glen Iris. And I continued my MBA, and I found a small house with a growing family. I had to do my study in the garden shed down the backyard. And I found that I would go down there of a Sunday morning to study, and then at about 10 to 10, the bell of St Faith's Burwood, as it was called in those days, would start ringing. St Faith's Burwood is in the next street from where I live. And that bell literally called me back into the church. So once I'd finished my MBA, because I was absolutely flat out and had no time, once I'd finished my MBA, I turned up at St Faith's Burwood, and I had, I'd have to say, the most fantastic welcome, the most fantastic welcome from the people and the vicar of St Faith's, and began a different kind of life in the church where I became much more engaged. And engaged actually to the point where I asked the vicar, this time, the vicar at this stage was the Reverend Dr. Colleen O'Reilly, who some of you may know, asked her what I could do to deepen my faith. She'd just come out of the Melbourne College of Divinity, and she suggested that I do the Trinity College online graduate diploma, which I did. And that was a very interesting thing for me to do. I by this time was working for IBM. My career had moved on. I moved out of Telstra, joined IBM, and I was travelling a lot again, and the online graduate diploma was a very portable thing to do. And it did deepen my interest, it did deepen my faith, and it opened my eyes to some new things. In particular, I remember a unit in business ethics, Christian ethics I should say, which I found quite engaging and quite exciting at the time. That led me to do an MA because I wanted to deepen my understanding of Christian ethics as it stood alongside how business works. And I started looking for how the church actually engaged with the business community. This became a question which was niggling at me. So I started asking around. And I had a memory at that time of Keith Rayner being a bishop in this diocese who very actively engaged the wider community, particularly the Premier at the time, Jeff Kennett, with whom he had some fundamental disagreements. But I could see a church that was actually engaged in the community in a way that I thought was a good life for the church to practice. So I started asking around, and I couldn't find anything in this diocese that had anything to do with the church engaging with the business community. And one morning after church at St Faith's, I think I asked this question to Archdeacon Rodney Oliver, who you may have met, and he looked at me. Now my memory may be slightly faulty and nostalgic here, but I think it was Rodney who said, "Well, Richard, it might just be you." So I finished my MA that I had started. As I said, I did an MA on how the church relates to the business community, focusing on the stock exchange top 30 companies. And then, as luck would have it, I picked up a copy of TMA in the narthex of the church, and it had an advertisement in it for the ordination program. Now, I was just at the end of my MA at this time. I was excited about what I was doing in relation to the business community, and I took myself from the IBM office across Prince's Bridge into the cathedral on the Monday morning after I saw this article, actually, as it was. And lo and behold, by 2 o'clock Monday afternoon, I'd signed up for the year of discernment. And that was my pathway into the church as an ordained priest. I went back to Trinity and did a little bit more study, and I completed the ordination program and started my life as a priest in the diocese. My first curacy was at St John's, Camberwell, not far from where I live. And it was there that I had my first opportunity to start an engagement with the business community. St John's, as you know, is located in a very busy retail and professional services business area. So we decided that we would have a crack at seeing what sort of relationships we could develop with the people in Camberwell. And it was remarkably successful. We had a program which ran for a couple of years in my time there, where we would run a quarterly business breakfast, and we'd get the people from roundabout would come in, we'd have a guest speaker, and we'd have a breakfast, and it was a really, really good engagement. A lot of people started coming through. By the end, we had a couple of hundred people on our email list, so we thought that was quite successful. But as all curacies do, mine had to end, and I moved on to St Peter's. We started the same thing, and that worked reasonably well, but by this stage I decided that we didn't really know enough about what we were doing in a theoretical sense, and there weren't many other engagements around like what we were doing, so we were kind of babes in the woods a little bit. So I decided to go hunting for more theory, and because I'm not a particularly disciplined person, I knew that the best way of doing that would be to do a PhD, because it had form and structure and had deadlines that I would have to meet. So as my curacy at St Peter's ended, I basically became a full-time student. I went back to Trinity and applied to join the doctoral program. That was accepted, and I've spent the last 5, almost 6 years since then doing a PhD, which I finished at the end of last year. In November I finally submitted the completed work and graduated in March this year. Towards the middle of last year, as my PhD was drawing to a close, I started thinking about how I would take the work that I'd done out into the community of Melbourne. And I started talking to clergy in parishes around Melbourne where I thought there might be a business community. And one of those clergy was Father John Sanderson, who I met one morning for a cup of coffee, and we were chatting, and I was talking to him about what I wanted to do and how I saw it working. And I actually saw his face change, as it turned out, during the conversation. And he said, "You know, I've got the place for you." And as you know, Father John is on the board of the Mission to Seafarers, and he introduced me to the board and the chief manager of the Mission to Seafarers, and I think this was probably in about November. And the chemistry and the energy between us was palpable, and away we went and started planning how what we planned to do was for me to do something like I was doing in Camberwell, based in the Mission to Seafarers in the Docklands, and focusing out into the Docklands business area on the north side of the river, and over on the south side of the river to what they call the Yarra Business District. So we started planning. By this stage, the year was drawing to a close, and we knew, business being business, nothing would happen much until about February, but we started planning across the period of the break. Then, of course, in February, COVID-19 hit us, so the whole thing has ground pretty much to a halt at the moment. But we do plan to do this piece of work. We have some ideas. I've started talking to people, doing Zoom conferences, of course, with people who might be able to help us and who we might be able to help. And we're working on this as we speak through the lockdown period, and just waiting for lockdown to complete so that we can actually get going. In the course of this conversation, Father John invited me to join you at St George's, and given that I hadn't really had any sort of permanent church association as a priest since leaving St Peter's, except for a short stint at St John's as an interim locum, I grabbed the opportunity, and so now I've become, or I'm in the process of becoming, hopefully, part of the parish, and it's a great thing for me to do, and I'm very grateful, particularly to Father John and to the people of St George's who have helped me. So you can see that I've had a fairly varied career. Some would argue that I can't settle down and work out what I want to do, but I think actually my call to work in the business community is the thing that I want to do. So that's what I'm going to focus my time on. How that works out in the context of St George's, until we get out of lockdown and can start talking with each other, it's a bit hard to tell. But I would be very interested to hear from you if you're interested in what I'm doing, and if you have any ideas, I would love to hear them. So that's a little bit about myself. I hope you found this interesting. Please put some questions in the comments below, and I'll have a look at them, or make contact with me directly. My details, I think, are in the pew sheet, but you can make contact with me through the church, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for listening. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I hope to talk to you again soon.